All right, for decades, the Jeffrey Epstein case has been just a storm of headlines and speculation, right? Today, we're going to cut through all of that noise. Think of this as a forensic audit, a clear, evidence-based look at how this criminal enterprise actually worked.
At the very heart of this case, you have this stark, horrifying contrast. On one hand, there's the public facade, a super wealthy financier. Sources of income kind of murky, but totally shielded by his connections to the world's most powerful people. And then, on the other hand, is the grim reality, the trafficking and abuse of teenage girls, some as young as 14, which ultimately led to his federal arrest in 2019. It's in that massive gap between perception and reality that this whole enterprise was allowed to operate.
So the big question is, how on earth did this operation keep going for so long? To understand that, we need to basically pop the hood and deconstruct the machinery behind it, the systems that were built not just to commit crimes, but to protect them.
The enterprise was really built on two core functions. First, there was a recruitment model that worked almost like a pyramid scheme, where victims themselves were often coerced into recruiting other underage girls. And second, there was this multi-layered strategy for ensuring silence. We're talking legal tools like NDAs, financial settlements, and just the immense psychological pressure of a billionaire against a teenager.
And of course, money was the engine that made it all run. And this wasn't some simple operation. It was a sophisticated financial machine. First, the actual source of Epstein's massive wealth was often a mystery. This money was then funneled through a maze of complex shell companies. Investigators found that large, unexplained cash withdrawals often lined up with victim visits. And finally, the victims were paid in cash to minimize any kind of paper trail. I mean, it was a textbook money laundering setup for criminal activity.
Now let's just zoom out and look at the scale of this thing. This wasn't happening in just one place. It was a global network. The abuse happened across a whole string of private properties, from a Manhattan residence to a ranch in New Mexico, an estate in Florida, an apartment in Paris, and, most infamously, his private islands in the U.S. Virgin Islands.
And here we can see how a location itself can become a tool of the crime. If we zoom in on Little St. James Island, you see what you could call an architecture of isolation. Forensic evidence confirms the entire property was designed for control and concealment. Surveillance cameras were installed all over the property, and the remote location itself worked to isolate victims, making escape or contact with the outside world feel nearly impossible.
This brings us to one of the most talked about and honestly most misunderstood parts of this case, the network of powerful people connected to Epstein. And this is where the legal distinctions are absolutely critical.
First, let's establish a clear, legally proven case of complicity. Ghislaine Maxwell. She was not just a social friend, she was a key operational partner, convicted back in 2021 and sentenced to 20 years in prison for her role in recruiting, grooming, and trafficking victims for Epstein.
And this is the question at the center of so much public interest, right? With all these famous names appearing in documents, what does it actually mean?
Here, you can see the huge legal difference between just knowing someone and being complicit in their crimes. While hundreds of names of powerful figures appear in documents like his contact books, being in that circle does not automatically place someone in the inner circle of proven criminal co-conspirators. The legal caveat is simple but vital. Being mentioned is not proof of guilt.
You know, the flight logs are a perfect example. This investigative note clarifies that while the logs can confirm a person was on Epstein's private jet, that fact alone doesn't prove they were involved in any criminal activity. It confirms presence, not participation, and that distinction is fundamental to understanding the actual evidence.
Okay, now we need to pivot. We have been looking at the enterprise itself, but now let's look at the justice system that was supposed to stop it, because a specific moment in time allowed this operation to keep running for another whole decade.
This timeline really puts it all into perspective. Phase 1 shows the active trafficking period. But look at Phase 2 in 2008. That wasn't the end. It was a critical legal failure, a really controversial plea deal that didn't stop the enterprise. It just delayed a real federal response for over a decade until the final collapse began in 2019.
The 2008 plea deal was incredibly lenient. It gave immunity not just to Epstein but to his co-conspirators as well. And crucially, it failed to notify victims, a violation that was later ruled illegal. Now compare that with the 2019 federal indictment, which charged him with sex trafficking of minors and acknowledged the pattern of abuse that was basically ignored back in 2008.
This finally brings us to the endgame, the rapid collapse of the enterprise after that 2019 arrest, and the profound questions that still remain unanswered.
So in August 2019, Epstein died in federal custody. The official ruling was suicide. However, as this incident report notes, the Department of Justice itself confirmed multiple serious institutional failures that night. Jail cameras malfunctioned, and guards failed to perform their mandatory checks. This combination of facts has, as you can imagine, fueled significant public doubt about the official story.
Legally, his death meant the criminal trial was over. He couldn't testify against anyone else. But it did not end the pursuit of justice. The fight just shifted to the civil courts, where victims filed lawsuits against his estate, and this forced the liquidation of all his assets, including his properties, to satisfy those claims.
So where does all this leave us? Jeffrey Epstein is dead, Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison, but as the case summary notes, crucial questions about the full extent of the network are still unresolved. Ultimately, this case stands as a historic and deeply disturbing example of how extreme wealth and power can be weaponized to build a criminal enterprise and, for a time, subvert the very systems designed to deliver justice.